The morning fog rolled in from the Atlantic, wrapping Rockport, Maine, in its familiar grey embrace as Detective Michael Doyle stood at the edge of the harbour, watching the fishing boats disappear into the mist. He'd been retired for 3 years, content to spend his days fixing old radios in his garage and avoiding the weight of other people's tragedies. The peace shattered when Chief Harrison's patrol car pulled up to his house at dawn, the engine's rumble cutting through the coastal quiet like a premonition. Sarah Mitchell, the elementary school teacher everyone in town adored, had vanished without a trace 3 days ago, and the local police were overwhelmed. They needed him back, Harrison said, just this once. The last time anyone saw Sarah was Friday afternoon, when she locked up her classroom at Rockport Elementary, waving goodbye to the janitor with her usual warm smile. Her car was found abandoned on the old Lighthouse Road Saturday morning, keys still in the ignition, her purse on the passenger seat untouched. No signs of struggle, no note, no explanation, just absence where a vibrant young woman should have been. Michael had known Sarah since she was a child. She'd grown up 3 houses down from him, and he'd watched her transform from a shy girl who collected sea glass into a devoted teacher who stayed late tutoring struggling students and organizing community events. Walking through Sarah's small cottage near the shore, Michael felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with every case, but this one cut deeper. The house was immaculate, as if she'd simply stepped out for groceries. Coffee mug in the sink, lesson plans spread across the kitchen table for the following week, a library book face down on the couch marking her place. The normalcy of it all felt wrong, like a stage set waiting for an actor who'd missed their cue. He picked up the book, a collection of Irish poetry, and noticed she'd underlined a passage about leaving without goodbye. His fingers trembled slightly as he set it back down exactly as he'd found it. Emma Walsh, a former student of Sarah's who now worked as a journalist for the Portland Press Herald, arrived as Michael was examining the bedroom. She was 25, ambitious, with an intensity that reminded him of himself before the job wore him down. "Detective Doyle," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying deeper emotion. "Sarah was my 4th-grade teacher. She's the reason I became a writer. She told me I had a voice worth hearing when everyone else thought I was just the weird kid who asked too many questions." Michael studied Emma carefully. She'd returned to Rockport 6 months ago after college and her first journalism job in Boston, drawn back by something she couldn't quite name. "You've been investigating on your own," he observed, noting the notebook clutched in her hand, pages already filled with notes. Emma nodded, no apology in her expression. "The paper isn't interested in a missing person case from small-town Maine. But I am. Sarah helped me through the worst year of my life when my mother died. I owe her this." They spent the afternoon interviewing neighbors, but Rockport's notorious reserve revealed itself in full force. People spoke in careful, measured sentences, offering nothing beyond surface observations. Sarah was lovely, dedicated, never caused trouble. Yet Michael caught the quick glances, the subtle shifts in posture, the way certain names caused conversations to stall. The town was keeping secrets, not malicious perhaps, but protective, the way small communities close ranks when threatened. Mrs. Patterson from next door mentioned Sarah had seemed distracted lately, then quickly amended that everyone gets tired by the end of the school year. Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store, said Sarah had been in Thursday buying rope and a tarp, then insisted it must have been for a school project. As evening approached, Michael and Emma sat in his kitchen, the case files spread between them like tea leaves they were trying to read. "There's something about the Lighthouse Road," Emma said suddenly. "Sarah never went there. She told me once it reminded her of something painful, but she never said what." Michael remembered the Lighthouse Road from his own painful history. 5 years ago, he'd failed to prevent a tragedy there, a teenage boy who jumped before he could talk him down. It was the case that broke him, sent him into early retirement. Now, Sarah's car had been found on that same stretch of desolate coastline. The phone rang, startling them both. It was Dr. James Crawford, Sarah's colleague at the school, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Detective, I need to speak with you. Not over the phone. Can you meet me at the school?" Something in his tone made Michael agree immediately. As they drove through the foggy streets, Emma beside him silent but alert, Michael felt the old instincts awakening. The way Crawford's voice had cracked, the timing of the call, the insistence on meeting at the school rather than the police station. People revealed themselves in these small choices. The school was dark except for Crawford's classroom, where they found him pacing between desks sized for children, his tall frame making the space seem even smaller. "Sarah and I were close," he began, then stopped, running his hands through his graying hair. "Not romantically, though people assumed. She was helping me through my divorce, and I was—" He paused again, and Michael saw the war playing out on his face between self-preservation and truth. "I was helping her deal with something from her past. Someone had been sending her letters, anonymous ones. They started 6 months ago, just after Emma returned to town." Emma stiffened beside Michael, but remained silent. Crawford continued, "She wouldn't show them to me, but they terrified her. She said they knew things about her that no one should know. Private things. She was planning to leave Rockport, had already applied for teaching positions in Portland and Boston." He pulled out a crumpled envelope from his jacket. "I found this in her desk drawer yesterday when I was looking for her grade book. I shouldn't have taken it, but—" Michael opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single photograph, aged and slightly yellowed. It showed a much younger Sarah, perhaps 16 or 17, standing on the lighthouse road with someone whose face had been carefully cut out. On the back, in neat handwriting, "Some sins don't wash away with the tide." Michael felt Emma lean in to look, heard her sharp intake of breath. "That's my mother's handwriting," she whispered, her journalist's composure finally cracking. "But that's impossible. She's been dead for 15 years. The revelation hung in the air like the fog outside, heavy and obscuring. Michael looked at Emma, seeing her anew. The young woman who'd returned to Rockport with such determination, who'd inserted herself into this investigation, who Sarah had helped through her mother's death. "Emma," he said quietly, "I think you need to tell me about your mother's relationship with Sarah." Emma's hands shook as she reached for the photograph. "I don't know what this means. My mother died when I was 10. Sarah was my teacher. That's all I know." But her eyes said differently, and Michael recognized the look of someone whose world was about to shatter. Crawford broke the silence. "There's more." Sarah had been visiting Father O'Brien at St. Catherine's every week. She wasn't religious, hadn't been to church in years, but suddenly she was there every Thursday evening. Maybe he knows something. Michael nodded, his mind already working through the connections. A young teacher, receiving threatening letters in her missing mother's handwriting, secret visits to a priest, a car abandoned on a road that held painful memories. The pieces were there, scattered like sea glass on the beach, waiting to be assembled into something that made sense. As they left the school, Emma grabbed Michael's arm. "Detective Doyle, what if we're not looking for a crime? What if Sarah left on her own? What if she's running from something?" Michael had been thinking the same thing, but there was something in Emma's voice that made him pause. Fear, yes, but also something else. Recognition, perhaps. Or guilt. "Then we need to find out what she was running from," he said. "And why now?" The fog had grown thicker, swallowing the town in its grey embrace, and Michael couldn't shake the feeling that Rockport itself was conspiring to keep its secrets buried. Father O'Brien's hands shook as he poured coffee in the rectory of St. Catherine's, the morning light filtering through stained glass windows, casting coloured shadows across his weathered face. Michael and Emma had arrived just after sunrise, finding the priest already awake, as if he'd been expecting them. "I've been praying about whether to come forward," he said, his Irish accent still thick after 40 years in Rockport. "The seal of confession is sacred. But Sarah never formally confessed. She came seeking guidance, wrestling with conscience." He set down 3 cups with deliberate care, the china rattling slightly against the saucers. 15 years ago, Father O'Brien began, his voice heavy with the weight of held secrets. There was an accident. Sarah was 17, a senior in high school. She and her best friend, Margaret Walsh, Emma's mother, were driving back from Portland after a concert. It was raining. The roads were slick. They hit someone on the Lighthouse Road. A drifter, the police said. No identification, no family looking for him. Emma's face had gone pale, her notebook forgotten in her lap. Michael watched her carefully as the priest continued. The girls panicked. Sarah wanted to call for help, but Margaret convinced her they'd be ruined, their futures destroyed. They left him there. Another driver found the body the next morning. The silence that followed was suffocating. Emma stood abruptly, walking to the window, her back to them. My mother never said anything, never even hinted. Her voice broke. Father O'Brien rose, moving toward her with pastoral instinct, but she held up a hand to stop him. Sarah knew I was investigating. She knew I'd eventually find out. That's why she ran. Michael processed this information, pieces clicking into place. The letters. Someone else knows about the accident. The priest nodded gravely. Sarah believed someone saw them that night. The letters started arriving after Emma's article about unsolved cases in Rockport was published in the Portland Press Herald. The article mentioned the John Doe from 1979. Michael pulled out his notebook, his detective's mind working through the timeline. Who else knew about this? Father O'Brien hesitated, then said, Margaret confessed to her husband before she died. Robert Walsh knew, and there was someone else in the car that night in the back seat. Sarah never told me who, said it wasn't her secret to reveal. Emma turned from the window, her face streaked with tears, but her expression determined. My father left Rockport right after my mother's funeral. He said he couldn't bear the memories, but he'd been strange before she died, distant, angry. They fought constantly those last months. They drove to the Lighthouse Road as the morning fog began to lift, revealing the harsh beauty of the Maine coastline. The spot where Sarah's car had been found was unremarkable, just a pull-off where tourists sometimes stopped for photos. But Michael saw it with different eyes now, imagining 2 terrified teenage girls on a rainy night, making a decision that would haunt them forever. Emma stood at the road's edge, staring at the rocks below where the Atlantic crashed endlessly. She was protecting me, she said quietly. All these years, Sarah was protecting me from the truth about my mother. A pickup truck pulled up behind them, and Michael recognized Tom Bradley from the hardware store. The man climbed out slowly, his face grim. Figured I'd find you here, he said. If you're looking for Sarah, you're looking in the wrong place. Michael stepped forward, his instincts alert. You know where she is? Tom shook his head. No, but I know why she left. My brother Danny was in the car that night. He was dating Margaret Walsh. He's the one who's been sending the letters. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Emma gasped, and Michael felt the case shifting beneath his feet like sand. Danny's been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years, Tom continued, his voice bitter. The guilt ate him alive. He tried to tell the truth after Margaret died, but no one believed him, said he was having another episode. When he saw Emma's article, something snapped. He became obsessed with making Sarah pay for her silence. Michael's mind raced. Where's Danny now? Tom's face darkened. That's what I'm trying to tell you. He's been missing for 3 days, same as Sarah. They spent the rest of the day searching for Danny Bradley, checking his usual haunts, the abandoned fishing shacks where he sometimes stayed when he was off his medication, the old quarry where local kids said he talked to himself for hours. Each location revealed more about the man's deteriorating mental state. They found pages of rambling writing, photos of Sarah taken from a distance, newspaper clippings about Emma's return to Rockport. The picture that emerged was of a man consumed by the past, unable to move forward, trapped in a moment of horror from 15 years ago. At Danny's most recent apartment, a squalid room above the old cannery, they found something that changed everything. A suicide note dated 3 days ago. The same day Sarah disappeared, but it wasn't just a goodbye. It was a confession, detailed and specific, about the night of the accident. Danny had been drunk, had grabbed the wheel from Margaret in a moment of stupid playfulness. He had caused the accident. The girls had protected him, taken the blame themselves, carried his guilt along with their own. He couldn't live with her returning, Michael said, reading the last lines. He wanted to confess to Sarah before... The note ended mid-sentence, as if he'd been interrupted. Emma sank onto Danny's unmade bed, overwhelmed. My mother died protecting him. Sarah disappeared, protecting me. Everyone in this town is protecting someone else's secrets. Michael sat beside her, feeling the weight of his own protected secrets, his own failures. That's what small towns do, he said. We hold each other's pain, sometimes to our own destruction. She looked at him with eyes that had aged years in the past 2 days. Is that what you did? Is that why you really retired? Before he could answer, his phone rang. Chief Harrison's voice was urgent. Michael, we've got something. A fisherman spotted 2 people on Seal Island early this morning, man and a woman. The description matches Sarah and Danny Bradley. Seal Island was 3 miles offshore, accessible only by boat, abandoned except for an old lighthouse keeper's cottage. If Danny had taken Sarah there, if he was as unstable as his writing suggested, time was running out. The boat ride to Seal Island was rough, the Atlantic choppy with an incoming storm. Emma insisted on coming despite Michael's protests, and he recognized the same determination that had once driven him before failure taught him the cost of certainty. The island loomed out of the grey waters like something from a nightmare, its abandoned lighthouse a broken finger pointing at the darkening sky. As they approached the dock, Michael saw movement in the cottage windows. Someone was definitely there. They found Sarah and Danny in the lighthouse keeper's cottage, but not as Michael had expected. Sarah was making soup on an old camp stove, while Danny sat wrapped in blankets, lucid but fragile. When she saw them, Sarah's face showed no surprise, only a deep exhaustion. I knew you'd find us, she said to Michael. You always were the best detective Rockport ever had, even when you tried not to be. Danny looked up, his eyes clear for perhaps the first time in years. I needed to tell her everything. She needed to know it wasn't her fault. None of it was her fault. Sarah moved toward Emma, her hands outstretched. I'm so sorry. I wanted to tell you about your mother, but how could I? How could I destroy your memory of her? Emma pulled back, anger finally breaking through her shock. By disappearing, by making us think you were dead, by putting the whole town through this. Sarah's composure cracked. I was going to die. Danny's note, his confession, I found him at the lighthouse road. He was going to jump. I couldn't let another person die there. Not when I could stop it this time. Michael understood then. This wasn't a kidnapping or a murder. It was 2 broken people trying to save each other from a shared past. Danny had brought Sarah here to confess, to finally release the truth he'd carried alone. And Sarah had come to prevent another tragedy on the Lighthouse Road, the place where all their ghosts converged. We need to get Danny to a hospital, Michael said gently. He needs proper help. Danny nodded, seeming relieved. I want to get better. For the first time in 15 years, I think I might want to live. As they prepared to leave the island, Sarah pulled Michael aside. That boy 5 years ago, the one who jumped, it wasn't your fault. Sometimes we can't save people, no matter how hard we try. Michael felt something release in his chest, a knot he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it wasn't part of him. Sometimes we can, though, he said, looking at Danny being helped onto the boat. Sometimes we get another chance. The Rockport police station had never seen such activity. Reporters from Portland and Boston crowded the small building, drawn by the story of the teacher who disappeared to save the man whose secret she'd protected for 15 years. Michael stood in Chief Harrison's office, watching through the blinds, as Sarah gave her statement in the interview room. Emma beside her taking notes with professional detachment that didn't quite hide the tremor in her hands. The truth was messier than anyone had imagined, a tangle of teenage mistakes, mental illness, and misguided protection that had shaped multiple lives. Danny Bradley had been transferred to Maine Medical Center's psychiatric unit, where doctors said his prospects were better than they'd been in years. The unburdening of his secret, combined with proper medication and Sarah's forgiveness, had given him something he'd lost long ago: hope. Tom Bradley had closed his hardware store for the first time in 20 years to be with his brother, their relationship beginning to heal after years of Tom's resentment over Danny's illness. "I blamed him for ruining his own life," Tom told Michael. "I never knew he was carrying the weight of ruining others too." Emma struggled the most with the revelations. She'd built her entire identity around her mother's memory, the strong woman who'd raised her alone after her father left, who died with dignity and grace. Learning that Margaret Walsh had been involved in a hit-and-run, had convinced her best friend to help cover it up, had let her boyfriend take the psychological fall for it, shattered the foundation of Emma's world. She spent hours in Sarah's cottage, going through old photos and letters, trying to reconcile the mother she'd known with the frightened teenager who'd made a terrible choice. "She was 17, Sarah said gently, sitting beside Emma on the floor surrounded by memories. "We were all 17. Danny was 18. We thought we were adults, but we were children making children's decisions with adult consequences." She pulled out a photo from their high school graduation, 3 weeks after the accident. In it, Margaret smiled brightly, but Sarah could see now what she'd missed then. The hollow look in her friend's eyes, the forced quality of her joy. "Your mother never forgave herself. She spent the rest of her life trying to make amends in other ways. Why do you think she volunteered at the homeless shelter every weekend? Why she took in foster kids before you were born?" Michael found himself drawn into the investigation's aftermath in ways he hadn't expected. The state police reviewed the 1979 case, but with all parties involved either dead or having been minors at the time, and with the statute of limitations long past, no charges would be filed. Still, the truth needed to be documented. Michael worked with the state investigators, helping them piece together what had really happened that night. The victim, it turned out, hadn't been a nameless drifter. His name was William Hennessy, a Vietnam veteran struggling with PTSD who'd been walking from Portland to Canada, searching for peace he never found. The discovery of William Hennessy's identity led to another revelation. He had a daughter, now living in Connecticut, who'd been searching for her father for 30 years. When she arrived in Rockport, Sarah insisted on meeting her. The conversation, held in Father O'Brien's rectory with Michael and Emma present as witnesses and support, was one of the most difficult Michael had ever observed. Sarah told William's daughter Carol everything: the accident, the panic, the cover-up, the years of guilt. Carol wept, but when Sarah offered a shaking apology, Carol took her hands. "You were a child," she said. "You made a terrible mistake, but you were a child. My father wouldn't want his death to destroy more lives." The town's reaction was complex. Some people, particularly the older generation who remembered the original incident, were scandalized. Others, especially those who knew Sarah as a teacher, struggled to reconcile the woman they respected with the teenager who'd made such a devastating choice. A few parents demanded her resignation from the school, but more signed a petition for her to stay. "We all have things we're not proud of," said Mrs. Chen, whose son Sarah had tutored through dyslexia. "What matters is who we become, despite our mistakes." Michael found his own reputation unexpectedly rehabilitated, solving the case, bringing everyone home alive, and handling the situation with discretion and compassion had reminded Rockport why he'd been their best detective. Chief Harrison formally asked him to return to the force as a consultant, and to Michael's surprise, he found himself considering it. The weight he'd carried since the Lighthouse Road suicide had lifted, replaced by something he hadn't felt in years: purpose. Emma's article about the case, written with Sarah's permission and Danny's blessing, won national attention. She wrote not about the sensational aspects, but about the human cost of secrets, the way small towns create their own justice systems, and how mental illness intersects with guilt and trauma. The Portland Press Herald offered her a full-time investigative position, but she surprised everyone by turning it down. "I need to stay in Rockport a little longer," she told Michael. "I need to understand who my mother really was. All of her, not just the parts that were easy to love." Sarah returned to teaching after a 2-week leave, walking into her classroom to find it exactly as she'd left it, her students having made a banner that read, "Welcome back, Ms. Mitchell." The first day was hard, feeling the weight of parents' eyes at pickup, knowing the whispers that followed her. But when young Timothy Chen ran up to hug her legs and tell her about the book he'd read while she was gone, she knew she was where she belonged. That afternoon, she found a note on her desk from the principal. "Teachers are human. Humans make mistakes. Great teachers learn from them and teach others to do the same. We're lucky to have you." The Lighthouse Road became a different place after the truth came out. The town council voted to install a memorial bench for William Hennessy, with a plaque that read, "In memory of those lost and found on this road, may we all find peace." Sarah and Emma went together to see it installed, standing in the spot where everything had gone wrong 15 years ago. "I used to avoid this place," Sarah said. "Now I think I need to come here regularly to remember and to honor him properly." Emma nodded, linking her arm through Sarah's. "My mother would want that. The real her, not the perfect version I created." Danny's recovery progressed slowly but steadily. The combination of proper treatment, lifted guilt, and his brother's support gave him stability he hadn't had in years. He began working part-time in Tom's hardware store, good with his hands when his mind was clear. Customers who'd avoided him for years began to see him differently, not as the town's unstable Bradley brother, but as someone fighting his way back to health. He and Sarah developed an unlikely friendship, built on shared truth and mutual forgiveness. Father O'Brien held a special service for healing and reconciliation, though he didn't specify what needed healing or who needed reconciling. The church was fuller than it had been in years. Sarah sat in the back row, Emma beside her with Michael on the other side. Danny and Tom were across the aisle. Carol Hennessy had stayed for the service before returning to Connecticut. As Father O'Brien spoke about the weight of secrets and the freedom of truth, Michael saw tears on many faces and wondered how many other secrets Rockport was hiding. A month after Sarah's return, she and Emma organized a community gathering at the elementary school. They called it Stories and Truth, an evening where people could share their own struggles with secrets, guilt, and redemption. Michael was skeptical anyone would participate, but the auditorium filled. One by one, townspeople stood and shared, affairs forgiven, addictions overcome, crimes atoned for, mistakes that had shaped them. It was Rockport laying itself bare, and in that vulnerability, finding strength. "You did something important," Michael told Sarah afterward as they cleaned up the auditorium. "You showed them it's possible to face the worst thing you've done and survive it." Sarah stopped sweeping, leaning on the broom. "I couldn't have done it without Danny forcing the truth out, or Emma coming home, or you agreeing to look for me." She paused, then added, "We save each other, don't we? In big ways and small ones. That's what communities do, even when we fail at it sometimes." As autumn arrived in Rockport, painting the coast in golds and reds, the town felt different. Not perfect, never perfect, but more honest. The secret that had poisoned 3 lives for 15 years had been excised, and in its place, something healthier was growing. Michael returned to detective work part-time, focusing on cold cases with compassion rather than just justice. Emma began writing a book about her mother, the real Margaret Walsh, flawed and human and loved. Danny continued his recovery, each good day a small victory. And Sarah taught her students about mistakes and redemption, using age-appropriate stories, but with a depth of understanding that made her lessons resonate. 6 months after the revelation, Rockport had settled into a new rhythm. The reporters were long gone, the sensation had died down, and the town had absorbed the truth into its collective memory, another layer in its long history of human failing and resilience. Michael stood in the renovated police station, looking at the cold case files he'd been reviewing. Since returning to work, he'd solved 3 cases, each one a puzzle of human pain that required empathy as much as investigation. His partnership with the state police had become a model for small-town law enforcement, balancing local knowledge with professional resources. Sarah's classroom had become a pilgrimage site of sorts for troubled teachers from around Maine. They came seeking advice from someone who'd survived public shame and professional crisis. She always told them the same thing. Children need to see that adults can make terrible mistakes and still become good people. That's hope. Her teaching had deepened, informed by hard-won wisdom about human nature. When one of her students was caught stealing lunch money, she handled it with a grace that the principal later called transformative justice in action. Emma's book, The Weight of Silence, A Daughter's Search for Truth, was in final edits with a Boston publisher. She'd interviewed everyone involved, even traveling to Connecticut multiple times to include Carol Hennessy's perspective. The book wasn't just about the accident and cover-up, but about how secrets shape families and communities across generations. She'd discovered that her father had left not just because of grief, but because Margaret had told him the truth on her deathbed, and he couldn't handle it. He'd sent a letter after reading Emma's article, asking to meet, but Emma wasn't ready yet. "Maybe someday," she told Michael, "but I'm still learning who I am without all the lies." Danny Bradley's transformation was the most remarkable. With consistent treatment and the support of his brother and the community, he'd stabilized in a way no one had thought possible. He'd even started attending community college, taking art classes where his troubled mind found expression in haunting but beautiful paintings. His work was being shown in a Portland gallery, with portions of the sales going to a fund for William Hennessy's memorial. "I paint what the guilt looked like," he explained to a reporter. "Now I'm learning to paint what healing looks like too." The 1-year anniversary of Sarah's disappearance approached with unexpected tension. Carol Hennessy wanted to hold a memorial service for her father in Rockport, a proper goodbye he'd never received. The town was divided. Some felt it would reopen wounds, others believed it was necessary for true closure. Sarah, surprising everyone, strongly supported the idea. "We owe him that," she said at a town meeting. "We owe him recognition, respect, and remembrance, not just as a victim, but as a person who mattered." The memorial was held on a crisp November day at the Lighthouse Road. The place of tragedy transformed into a space of remembrance. Carol spoke about her father's service in Vietnam, his struggle with what would later be understood as PTSD, his love of poetry and music. Sarah read a letter of apology that she'd written and rewritten dozens of times. Danny, his hands shaking but his voice clear, spoke about the weight of causing death and the slow path to self-forgiveness. Emma read a passage from her book about how truth, even painful truth, is the foundation of genuine community. Father O'Brien blessed the memorial bench and the new garden planted around it. The lighthouse keeper, inspired by the story, had restored the old lighthouse and dedicated it as a sanctuary for those dealing with trauma and guilt. It would be open 1 day a week for anyone who needed a quiet place to confront their demons. Michael was asked to serve on the board, along with Sarah, Carol, and surprisingly, Danny. "We're the board of broken people," Danny said with a laugh that was still learning to be genuine. That evening, the core group gathered at Sarah's cottage. Michael, Emma, Sarah, Danny, Tom, and Father O'Brien. They'd become an unlikely family, bonded by crisis and held together by choice. As they shared dinner, the conversation turned to the future. Emma had been offered a position with the Boston Globe, but was considering starting an online magazine focused on restorative justice. Danny wanted to use his art to help other people with mental illness express their experiences. Sarah was developing a curriculum about ethical decision-making for high schoolers, using her own story as a cautionary tale. "You know what I've learned?" Michael said, surprising himself by speaking so openly. "Shame thrives in darkness. It feeds on silence. What we did here, bringing everything into the light, it didn't just solve a case. It healed a community, or at least started to." Father O'Brien raised his glass of wine. "To the courage of confession," he said, "and to the grace of forgiveness, both of others and ourselves." 3 months later, Rockport hosted its first Truth and Reconciliation Day, inspired by Sarah's story, but expanded to encompass anyone who wanted to share or seek forgiveness. The event drew people from all over Maine, some coming to confess old wrongs, others to forgive, many just to witness. A documentary crew filmed it, later turning it into a PBS special about how small towns can model restorative justice. Michael was interviewed extensively, his journey from burnt-out detective to community healer becoming a central thread. Emma finally met with her father, Robert Walsh, in a Portland coffee shop. He was older, grayer, carrying his own burden of guilt for abandoning his daughter when she needed him most. "I couldn't look at you without seeing your mother," he admitted, "and I couldn't look at your mother's memory, knowing what I knew." Emma, strengthened by her journey through truth, was able to offer him something she hadn't expected: understanding. "We all ran from it in different ways," she said. "At least you just ran. Mom and Sarah carried it. Danny was destroyed by it. Maybe running was the sanest response." Sarah and Michael grew closer through their work on various community initiatives. What started as professional respect evolved into friendship and then, quietly, into something more. They were both too damaged and too wise to rush into anything, but there was a comfort in their shared understanding of failure and redemption. "We're not a romance novel," Sarah told Emma with a laugh. "We're more like a recovery meeting that happens to involve dinner and movies." The state of Maine recognized Rockport's innovative approach to community healing with a grant to establish the Hennessy Center for Restorative Justice. It would be housed in the renovated lighthouse, offering mediation services, support groups, and training for other communities. Danny was hired as a peer counselor, his lived experience of mental illness and recovery making him uniquely qualified to help others. Tom Bradley donated materials for the renovation, saying it was the least he could do to honor both his brother's recovery and William Hennessy's memory. On the 2nd anniversary of Sarah's disappearance, instead of marking the traumatic event, the town celebrated Return Day, commemorating not just Sarah's physical return, but the community's return to honesty and connection. The elementary school children performed a play they'd written about making mistakes and making amends. Danny's art was displayed in the school hallway, his journey from destruction to creation inspiring young artists. Emma's book had been published to critical acclaim, with portions of the proceeds going to mental health services in rural Maine. As Michael walked through town that evening, he reflected on the journey they'd all taken. 2 years ago, he'd been a retired detective hiding from his failures. Now he was part of something larger, a community that had learned to face its shadows and transform them into wisdom. The case of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance had become something no one expected, a story of collective redemption. Sarah found him at the Lighthouse Memorial Garden, now blooming with plants chosen by Carol Hennessy to represent her father's favorite places. "Thinking about the case?" she asked, sitting beside him on William Hennessy's bench. Michael shook his head, thinking about after. How we all became different people, or maybe just finally became ourselves. Sarah took his hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything they'd been through. "That's what truth does," she said. "It doesn't just reveal who we were. It creates space for who we can become." As the sun set over the Atlantic, painting the sky in shades of forgiveness, Rockport settled into evening. In homes throughout the town, people who'd once hidden behind pleasant facades now lived with a harder but more honest grace. The mystery of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance had been solved, but the greater mystery, how a community confronts its collective sins and emerges stronger, continued to unfold. Michael squeezed Sarah's hand, thinking about the young detective he'd been, so certain that justice was about punishment. Now he understood it was about something else entirely, the slow, difficult, necessary work of turning wounds into wisdom, secrets into stories, and shame into the possibility of redemption. Emma's final line in her book captured it perfectly. We searched for a missing woman and found our missing selves. In bringing Sarah home, we all came home to the truth of who we are. Flawed, frightened, capable of terrible mistakes, but also capable of courage, forgiveness, and the kind of love that sees all and chooses to stay. The story of Sarah Mitchell's disappearance had ended, but the story of Rockport's transformation had just begun.